Okay, my name's Paul Fox. I am the British ambassador to Hungary, and it is a real pleasure today to welcome uh, Peter Pomerantsev to Budapest. He's a man who needs no introduction, so therefore I will give him an introduction. Um, he is a writer, a journalist, and an academic who was born in the USSR, in what is now Ukraine, in a Russian-speaking family, Jewish heritage, and has lived in the UK and now lives in the USA. He is an author of best-selling books, including This Is Not Propaganda, his most recent book. Well, it's not his most recent book. He's actually written a very good book on Britain's wartime efforts to counter Nazi propaganda. His initial book was Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which I think drew from his time living and working in Russia in the early 2000s. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Peter here today. He last visited, I think, in February 2020, and so much has changed since then. I mean, obviously, I can talk about the war at great length, but you don't need me to, go into great detail about what has happened following the invasion, unprovoked aggression against Ukraine by Putin and Russia. Since then, millions of Ukrainians have been displaced. Tens of thousands have lost their lives on both sides. And Russia continues with its war of aggression, which I think shows at the moment they are not really that serious about reaching a just peace. So, and at the same time, we should remember that the clearest path to peace is if Russia just withdraws its forces from Ukraine. It's fairly straightforward, it's fairly simple, but of course life is never straightforward and simple. I mean, a just and lasting peace is absolutely essential. It's essential not just for Ukraine, but for Europe and for the transatlantic community, for our security and for our prosperity. And we, the UK, have been clear from the outset that we will support the Ukraine to achieve a just peace on its own terms. We earlier this year signed a 100-year partnership with Ukraine with the aim of strengthening the relationship between our two countries and providing security and support for Ukraine. And I think we also need to continue to hold Russia to account for their actions. And this is where we'll probably hear more from Peter about this, how we increase our own resilience to counter malign Russian activity. It's the tools they use, the approaches they adopt, and the results they achieve are worth examining in order to understand what we can do to counter them. I suppose I should say a few words about Hungary as well. One could say that, for the Hungarians, everything has changed, but nothing has changed. In that their approach to the conflict has revolved around a peace narrative. But it's a peace narrative based on the notion that there needs to be an immediate peace, an immediate ceasefire. All support to Ukraine should be stopped, which in effect amounts to giving Russia what it wants. And what we've seen from the Hungarian government in the last 3 years is a doubling down of the position which they had adopted before that, which is to be, how can one put it, forward-leaning towards Moscow. And I think that continues, and it certainly informs the whole approach to this issue and their policies and their behaviours. Anyway, let me finish by thanking Peter for accepting our invitation. look forward to hearing you share your expertise and insight on Russia's information warfare. I mean, the theme today is Russia's information warfare against Ukraine, and Peter in particular is going to be talking about how to end Russia's information war. And I'd also like to thank Peter Kreko and Political Capital for their partnership in making sure this important visit came about. So thank you very much, Peter. And I think you want to say a few words as well, so please.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I would like to first thank you for the UK Embassy for making it possible to co-organize this event again. And this event fits in a line of discussions and events together with the British Embassy, in which Political Capital tries to invite important public intellectuals who can inspire debates in Hungary. And I'm really happy to have here my friend Peter Pomerantsev once again. So Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, famously said that no man ever steps in the river twice, for it's not the same river and it's not the same man. And today we are going to challenge this principle, because it's definitely the same man who we invited back to 2020, but it was a different river, as Paul Fox have already described. It was pre-invasion, it was at the beginning of the COVID, and it was the last year of the first Trump administration. So Peter is a perfect messenger to talk about all the changing world that we are living in, as someone who was born in Kiev in the USSR and grew up in London, then worked in Moscow, and right now stays in the United States. And also I have to mention about him that he's also a board member of the Hungarian Digital Media Observatory, so an anti-disinformation cooperation that Political Capital is part of. So what we are going to do today is I will pass over the floor soon to Peter, who is going to deliver a 15-20 minutes talk about how to win an information war. So this will be one topic for our discussion: information war, disinformation, one of the prime topics topics of expertise for Peter. And then a roundtable would continue with brilliant experts on disinformation, on security policy, that will be moderated by Edith Inotai. And the whole discussion is going to be finished in 2 hours. And I would like to thank again for Paul Fox for the introductory remarks, and also for Jenny and Levi for the UK Embassy for co-organizing this event. I would like to thank to my colleagues as well to making it possible, and thank you all for coming. And it's glad to see that our great guest Peter have raised so big attention and also high interest. So without further ado, I would like to pass over the floor to Peter.
Hi, thank you everybody for coming. If I start speaking too fast, just wave to me to slow down. That's nothing to do with Hungary. I often talk too fast, and that's one of my many defects. So listen, I've written 3 books now about propaganda, what we've just referred to as information war. And the reason I've written 3 books, and I'm now planning a 4th one, is that what seems like a limited subject is actually much more than that. It gets us into question of the relationship between information and democracy. What is a public sphere? Yeah. It gets us into questions of human psychology and the narratives and the stories we tell each other. And only finally does it actually get into the tactics of disinformation campaigns. So I think in today's little sort of talk, which I think is really going to be just a prelude to the discussion we have, I wanted to sort of try to take this sort of define the bigger set of challenges we're talking about, because I think this discussion often gets confused and lost, because actually we're talking about so many things at the same time. Conversations about information war will sort of range from concrete Russian disinformation tactics to theories of what is democratic communication. And all of these things are relevant. So I'm going to try to pass them out, show how they're interlinked, and how Russia or the Kremlin takes advantage of them, and how we can start to think about solutions. I mean, first of all, what we're facing is something that is bigger than the Kremlin. Yeah, it's something that the Kremlin takes advantage of, which is, in democracies, a sort of structural disintegration of the public sphere. Yeah? My second book was really about this. This is not propaganda. How in the 20th century, we came up with a bunch of simplified formula which defined a healthy democratic public sphere and contrasted it to a dictatorial one. So my parents were mentioned a couple of times already, and my parents were Soviet dissidents, not unlike the dissident movement here in Hungary. They were arrested by the KGB for the heinous sin of handing out books, handing out copies of Solzhenitsyn and Nabokov. My father received was going to receive a 7-year sentence. He was then exiled. And that was a very sort of, a distillation of how we thought about a democratic information environment in the 20th century. It was the battle against censorship, the battle for more information, the struggle for pluralism as opposed to authoritarian control. Today, we see a different set of challenges. Yeah? In many environments, those challenges remain. There are many oppressive regimes across the world, and some even in Europe. But the challenges have changed. Yeah? We see in America, where I live, pluralism tipping into a polarization so strong that democratic debate is undermined. We see tactics by authoritarian regimes not just to limit the amount of information, but to flood the environment with so much information, disinformation, all forms of content, that the truth is lost, and people become cynical and, in their own way, censored through noise. Yeah? So all the things that we kind of thought equaled a democratic information space have been undermined within a new information environment. Russia, of course, takes advantage of it with non-stop campaigns to confuse the environment even further. Attacks by troll farms onto dissidents at home and anybody they don't like abroad. So they take advantage of this environment. And in order to try to make sense of it, in order to try to remedy it, democracies are in a state of confusion. There are attempts made to regulate against disinformation. Yeah? There were ideas around this put forward in Germany, in Australia, and the minute that happens, the Kremlins of this world, and now also the J.D. Vances of this world, will start saying, well, hold on, you want to regulate content? That's censorship. We thought you were Democrats. We thought you were against this. Didn't you spend the whole 20th century telling us that censorship is evil? And now you want to do censorship? And we can dismiss the cynicism of those arguments because they're cynical. But if you look at the reaction of a lot of human rights groups around attempts to regulate disinformation, it's exactly the same. There is nothing in Article 19 of the Declaration of Human Rights about disinformation. There's just the right to give and receive information. So we're actually in a very deep bind. Yeah? This is a very deep philosophical, political crisis. Yeah? If we are about freedom of information, what is it that we're trying to regulate? There is no legal term, disinformation. We use it casually. We've used it today several times. It doesn't exist in any legal category. Now, I believe there's a way out. And I believe that if the arguments in Washington around concerns on this issue were being made in good faith, and if European legislators were wise, I believe we can come together on a common meaning that would be a democratic way to regulate this space. We live in a kind of paradox. There's more information than ever before, yeah? Including in a country like Russia. Much more access to information in Russia than there was in the Soviet Union. But we have less of an understanding about how that information or disinformation is distributed, targeted, scaled, and created. We have no idea about why on a platform like X or Telegram we see one piece of content and not another. Yeah? We have no idea who is behind these campaigns. Well, it's completely in the dark. We live in a different sort of censorship where we have no understanding about how our information environment is curated. Now remember what the Article 19 of the Declaration of Human Rights says, yeah? The right to impart and receive information. We can use that logic to say algorithmic transparency. Any type of campaign we see online, we should understand who is behind it. Anonymity is fine for individuals, but an organized campaign should clearly state who is behind it. Is it the Kremlin? Is it a proxy? Is it some other actor? We should be able to understand whether on a platform why something we see is elevated and something else is suppressed. Is there actually a fair and balanced approach to giving a voice to everybody? That sort of approach would both undermine some of the more malign activity we see coming out of America and would be completely antithetical to the Kremlin. Because the way the Kremlin approaches the digital space is to control social media companies inside Russia, completely manipulate what people see, censor it, create troll farms that spread malign forms of untransparent activity. So that one step, yeah, would blast open our information environment, make it truly transparent, be totally in line with the logic of fighting censorship. And if our friends in America were making their arguments in good faith around this space, I think we could come together on this issue, and it would radically reduce the ability of malign actors like the Kremlin to wage their campaigns. So that's the public sphere question. How do we move towards a truly democratic public sphere in the 21st century? There's another issue, though. That's almost like an issue of how we arrange, the room of our public debate. How do we make it more inclusive, more transparent, and more genuinely democratic? And that's the bit of propaganda that I'm most fascinated by, which is propaganda as the stories that we tell as a society to make sense of ourselves. So my favorite philosopher on the topic of propaganda, Jacques Ellul, calls this sociological propaganda. He doesn't mean it in a negative way. He means the big stories that we tell ourselves in order to give ourselves meaning and a sense of community. So in America, it's the American dream, the American way of life, those sorts of things. And of course, in the 20th century, the great story that democracies told was the story of freedom. Yeah? It was told through free jazz, modernist literature, which was such a powerful challenge to authoritarian rule. It was told through, both the arts and the language of rights and the language of music, and of course the language of politics. So what we've seen the last few years is authoritarian regimes led by the Kremlin, because the Kremlin has been the most vocal about this, saying the era of freedom is over and what we need now is strength and their version of security and their version of community, which is the community of the of the mob and the security of a certain type of identity based on a bullying type of personality that we see emerging in politics across the world, sometimes referred to as strongmen. I just don't think they're very strong. I don't know if you have been reading the Kremlin's reaction to Trump's victory, but Vladislav Surkov, who used to be in charge of propaganda in Russia and now is just an essayist, immediately wrote, "This is the final defeat of the freedom narrative." Yeah? It has stopped appealing to people. Yeah? And we were the first to spot that, he said. We spotted it first. And now America has caught up with us. And you can dismiss this as trolling, but when I look at the data in America, where I now live, they're onto something. So the amount of people who put security, community, some sense of stability as their most pressing concern in America has been going up and going up and going up and going up. Yeah? There is a really strong demand for it. A lot of the narratives around freedom are making a lot of people in the mainstream deeply uncomfortable. Yeah? Free economics now means chaos. You lose your job. You don't know who you are anymore. Economic disruption. Freedom of movement has become associated with uncontrolled immigration in the US. But even deeper than that, people seem to feel there is so much change that they don't know who they are anymore. You can't ignore that. If that's how people feel, you have to engage with those feelings. You can do that in a malign way, in an evil way, the way Putin does. Or you can start to tell stories and start to think about how you cultivate a healthy version of community. Yeah? If there's one which is about big walls and destroying any kind of foreign element, which makes me as an Eastern European Jew very jumpy, what is the healthy type of community? What is the European defense story at every level? Yeah? So I think that's very, very important. And then thirdly, when we're talking about information war and the issues that we need to address, there's the one I think that we think about the most every day, which are the tactics that Russia uses, the campaigns and the strategies in order to advance their foreign policy aims. We have to be clear about what Russia means by information war. They usually refer to it as information psychological war, and they don't just mean propaganda and media. They mean the full suite of tools in order to achieve their effect. So that includes corruption, influencing parties, influencing and buying up media, influencing business people. It can sometimes borderline mean assassinations. Yeah? That's a slightly different department, but assassinations can be a sort of propaganda of the deed. So this is all seen as one thing. So when we limit ourselves to debunking, we're slightly missing the wood for the trees or the trees for the woods. In any case, we're not doing enough. I think it's an incredibly important activity. I think truth has to be defended. But don't think that this is the solution. Yeah? Their aim is to use all these tools for their foreign policy aims. And we in Europe and in Britain have to understand what's about to hit us. Yeah? Since the clear signals that America is giving that it is not so much interested or not so much invested in European security anymore, the Kremlin has changed its positions. America is now a potential friend, but less of an enemy, in any case. And in the words of Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, all the evil in the history of the world has always come from one place, Europe. Europe must be destroyed. They mean Europe as an emerging defense project. They mean the EU as coordinated sanctions, but most of all, they mean the right of European countries to have any kind of genuine sovereignty. All the machinery of information psychological war that has been targeted on the US, which is not just propaganda campaigns, it's been relentless cyber attacks against American water utilities, oil pipelines, public bodies, will now be turned and fully focused onto Europe. That is all that they will be doing in the next 12 to 24 months. And they will be using their full range of activities. If you start to go through the database of what they are up to in Germany, which is the main target, and Poland, which is the second main target, it is relentless. Arson, assassinations, online campaigns, overt propaganda, buying up political influence, cyber attacks. Poland is now the most cyber attacked country in the world, I think. This is just the beginning. So if we're going to counter this, it'll mean having to think about it institutionally. Whose job is it to counter it? Yeah. And it'll mean, and here I'd love to open up a discussion, and I'll sort of finish up, is like, what is going to be our version of it? We know what they do. Cyber attacks, troll farms, corruption. What's going to be our version? Are we going to adapt the same tactics as them? Are we going to think about what the democratic toolkit is? Yeah. If they do troll farms, do we do, I don't know, online town halls? If they do corruption, how can we focus our investigative journalism that it actually disrupts their financial models? That's the discussion that we need to have. You know, we've always thought about this space in terms of soft power. Soft power is not going to save us. We've always thought about this in terms of democratic development. That's lovely. That's not going to save us. Until we start developing our own forms of sharp power, but ones which I think have to be in line with what we're best at, and with at least some of our values, we're going to lose. Good. Should we have a panel?
So, Peter, thank you very much for this, well, I would say inspiring, but also somewhat menacing speech. And just, you know, enlightening a bit what's ahead of us in the next couple of months and what we should be prepared for. I don't know whether we are prepared for that, actually, in Europe, but we will talk a little bit with our experts on what to do and what could be done. And first of all, let me just introduce the panel. You all know already Peter Pomerantsev, who is a senior fellow of the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Peter Greco, director of political capital, Dorka Takachi, Russia and Ukraine expert and researcher of the Center of Euro-Atlantic Integration and Democracy. And last but not least, Mark Takács, who is a military expert, ex-captain from the Hungarian Defense Forces. So he's going to be our security and defense analyst this afternoon. So after this this menacing and thought-provoking talk, let's turn a little bit our attention to the security and to the diplomatic sphere. And my first question would go to Peter Pomerantsev, because he is based in Washington, as far as I know. So he's our US expert, and I think we would very much like to know what's happening in the US at the moment. And with Donald Trump in the White House and all those dramatic scenes that we watched in TV with Zelensky in the White House practically being kicked out, and all the turn of the US diplomacy, how is this strategy assessed right now in the US, in Washington, putting pressure on small countries and allying with Putin and with Russia? How is that seen in Washington?
So look, my focus is on propaganda, and I've been doing a lot of research about American audiences, as you can tell from my little talk, and trying to understand what motivates them and what moves them, and it's hard to talk in terms of strategy for most Americans. They don't see the world in terms of strategies. They see the world as somewhere very confusing, and that essentially their relationships with the world are increasingly informed by a foreign policy of feelings. And I think Donald Trump understands that very well. And his base, the people who are most pro him, essentially want America to be the prime country in the world, but not to get entangled in anything. So they want both. So they are the most avid to say, much more than Democrats, America should be the prime power. We can't let China be number one. And then the follow-up question, well, do you want to do anything about Taiwan? They're like, oh, God, no. So they want both. They want the feeling of primacy with zero danger or commitments. And in some ways, you could say he's delivering on that. So there is a bit of the electorate he knows very well. What looks to us like bullying will look to many as brilliant. But that's only one part of America. There may be 25%. There are many others who, by far the largest group, who desire stability and order. And they see Russia, to the extent they think about Russia at all, they see it as a disruptor who's causing chaos. And for them, I think you get the narrative of like, I'm bringing peace. I, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin want peace. And it's these chaotic Ukrainians who dare to cause chaos. So he's aware of that audience as well, and that's where you get the peace narrative from. So you can see him playing to those audiences, and it's very much a foreign policy of feeling. I don't think the word, it's quite hilarious. People in Washington are still writing about, is Donald Trump trying a triple Nixonian twist with a bit of a Kissingerian flavor? Is he McKinley? He's just like, he's just America's id. He knows, it's the foreign policy of id, and he knows exactly what he's doing. And don't underestimate him on that. So yeah, I don't know if we can put this down to a neo-realist strategy or something like that. I'm sure, I lived in Russia where Putin was guided by similar instincts, and then you had these coterie of intellectuals around him. If you follow Russia, you know the names, like Lukyanov and all these guys, who would try to give a philosophy to what was really a deep understanding of how to satisfy the very, very contradictory impulses of Russian grievances and angers through a story about foreign policy. And I'll finish on this, where Putin kind of went wrong was that he started to believe his own propaganda. This is the danger of these propaganda-driven models. They work as long as you're supremely cynical and are just manipulating. The moment you actually start believing it and fall into it and start believing your own propaganda and acting on it, then stuff gets really messy and you think you're going to take Kiev in 3 days. So with the American administration, it's unclear, and really the discussion in DC and in Ottawa, and in Mexico City, and in London, is like, is this a game, or are they actually, they believe it? No, it's a game. So that's where we are in terms of trying to work it out.
Very reassuring, really. Yeah.
And I think the signs are they believe it.
All right. Before we go a little bit deeper in propaganda and disinformation, I would like to invite two of my colleagues who are experts on Ukraine to evaluate a little bit the effects of the Trump administration and the first measures, cutting aid, cutting access to intelligence in Ukraine. What are the consequences? How does that unfold in Ukraine, and how is it seen by Ukrainians? Dorka, perhaps, would you like to start?
Well, probably it would be easier if I talked about how it's being seen first, because eventually, then afterwards, Mark can elaborate on what actually is happening on the ground, because he's much better at that. But looking at and following the Ukrainian media, well, we can clearly see that the Ukrainian audiences judge it as devastating news altogether. So what we have clearly seen is that the Ukrainian audiences interpret all what they see as the biggest backstab they could potentially imagine. So how they interpret the terrible Trump-Zelensky meeting, that as it was a trap being constructed for Trump, and even the key opposition figures of Ukraine talk about it that way. So what we can clearly see is that there is no distinction. We cannot really see these clear divisive lines between the parties, between party communications in Ukraine. What we can see, however, is this rallying around the flag, closing around President Zelensky, and talking about how terribly misled and trapped he was when he went to DC. So what we can see is that the Ukrainian audiences were genuinely struck and shocked when they started to hear back those Russian propaganda lies they have been countering and they have been hearing for years and years already, when they have heard it from the president himself. Well, that was something to raise the eyebrows everywhere, all around the world. Ukraine was no exception from that. However, obviously, the emotions stirred by that were, I think, unmatched anywhere else. I have not seen any public opinion polls being made after this terrible meeting. However, looking at the media coverage, I have not met a single opinion article during my research where I would not have heard these narratives, which I have already mentioned, which clearly shows that they are being upset, and how they see is pretty unanimous. And one more thing before I finish it here is that they were especially upset when they have heard about Zelensky being a dictator and this pushing for immediate elections to be held. Well, that tells a lot when even the key political opponents of the current president talk against it. And even Petro Poroshenko, for instance, Yulia Tymoshenko, well, they cannot really be accused of being too much pro-Zelensky, right? And even they themselves have proclaimed that, well, this is not how it works. This is not the time to call for elections. We are in a state of war, so no. So when even the key opposition figures call it being misled and call it absolutely inappropriate to talk about these topics, well, that tells a lot about how unified Ukraine, at least in this question at the moment, is.
Thank you so much. Mark, let's talk a little bit about the situation in the country and in the military front.
So first of all, thank you for having me here and for the invitation. And I have to underline, sir, that your expose was quite interesting. This was the first time in 4 years I actually made notes on my phone, so thank you. I mean, really, yeah. So on the ground, it really, actually, it has a lot in terms of the interpretation. It has a lot in common in propaganda and misinformation, because in these actual days, like today, yesterday, and day before yesterday, Russian offensive is happening in Russia, in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian Suja salient, and they interpreted that, oh, this is the result of the American cut in aids and cut in intelligence, which is a big fat lie. If you see the ground, if you see the events, they already preparing this operation since early December. It was clear to be seen from the deployment of Russian recon and attack strike drones, tactical level strike drones. Sorry, and so this is only one type of these lies. And yes, now they try to squeeze the Ukrainians out from the Russian soil. And the other thing, because why I say that it could be seen now. Yes, I think it is fairly and widely known there is a transparent battlefield, the so-called naked battlefield in Ukraine. Everybody is visible and audible, and everybody sees everybody. From the line of contact to both directions, 15 kilometers, you will get hit by a drone or artillery because everything is visible and audible. And in these circumstances, the only option to execute offensive operations is not what I was taught as a young lieutenant to gather armored forces and artillery preparation and break through and draw a sword and kill everybody. No, that's not how it works anymore, at least in Ukraine, in near-peer conflict. Because the only thing it works, you have to prepare it, pre-plan it, and for months. Like 2 or 3 months, you have to cut the logistic ties. You have to slowly degrade the reinforcements that sent before to the front line. You have to find the so-called choke points on the main supply routes and secondary supply routes, exploit the weather, the muddy season, for example. And after that, there is a good saying, it's said by General Curtis LeMay, to the Japanese, and in the Second World War, he said, if you kill enough of them, they will stop fighting sooner or later. And that's what the Russians do in terms of firepower. That's how they try to grind forward, and this is why I said this is clearly visible. It was clearly visible already way before anybody mentioned cutting the aid and the intelligence aid to Ukraine from the US. And what is happening on the front valley depends. For a unit which has a European arsenal, European arms, it will mainly not mean that much. But in terms of intelligence or information or lack of information, it will mean a lot. For example, at the brigade level, where I'm familiar, my last position was an academic lecturer and for battalion and brigade staff officers. And for the brigade level operations like MDMP, if you miss information from the enemy division's second echelon, it will cost lives, I mean hundreds. And so cutting the intelligence, it will mean a lot. So cutting some artillery shells, cutting some ammunition, it will not mean a lot if Europe can ramp up its production or can buy from other sources. This is my short answer.
All right, thank you very much. So what you're saying is that we don't see the consequences at the moment, but it could be worse.
Maybe I said it wrong, and it's my fault. Sorry. We already see, and as it always in war, there is an example for everything and the opposite of this thing. Because it depends on the staff, the level of training, the equipment. This is what it decides. So, for example, a brigade which has very good staff officers, very well experienced and trained commanders and young NCOs, and they use European technology, they will suffer less than a brigade who is understaffed, undertrained, and tried to use some American technology. So there are huge differences in the level. But of course, it already made its presence felt. For example, in terms of countering the Russian strategic air campaign against the Ukrainian electronic power grid and the military-industrial complex. But in the tactical level, it has been not that felt so badly so far, but it will.
All right, let me just ask one question to all of our panelists, because that intrigues me. How do you see, since Trump is in power, are the chances for a dignified peace in Ukraine further off, or do they come closer? Do we have more chances for a dignified peace, or it's just off and Ukraine has to settle for what it comes? Peter Krakow.
Yeah, I do not really see the real commitment from the side of the Russian decision makers to go into a peace agreement. In fact, what they are telling in public is just the very opposite, that this is not the right time, not even for a ceasefire, not to talk about the total so-called peace plan. First, second, even if there would be such an agreement, I mean, under the strong pressure of the United States, we can have doubts about how how sustainable it would be, given that Putin's Russia have went against many of its promises and also many of the international obligations in the last few years. Just to remind us of one thing, he promised back to 2014, right after the annexation of Crimea, that Russia does not have any more territorial demands towards Ukraine, and then we could see 8 years later what happened. So in short, I don't think that there is a better chance for a peace, but and also we can think about how much what the American strategy is about is about making peace as quick as possible and as sustainable as possible. But the steps that the US administration have done so far have practically all favored Russia in that conflict. And it would be great to see some measures that go to the different direction. If, let's be at least, let's bring some compulsory optimism in the discussion. As we speak, we have the discussions in Riyadh between the Ukrainians and the Americans. Hope that they can bring about some success, and the United States will keep supporting Ukraine with weapons, with financial means, and also with intelligence.
The other Peter, there is this notion that all what Trump wants is to get the Nobel Peace Prize for
fiction.
Well, I don't know. Has he ever written anything original?
Well, Churchill won it for fiction.
Yeah,
so I mean, so why couldn't Trump? I mean, he's definitely. If you look at him as a sort of like a phenomenon of Dadaist literature, then maybe. So
that could be the way to achieve the peace Nobel Prize, if he kind of achieves peace between Ukraine and Russia. Is this what triggers him?
What actually triggers him, because there's been a lot of thinking about that in DC, is, obviously it's the ego thing and looking big. We all know that, winning. But really what triggers him is loyalty and control. He is obsessed with this, like many people of a certain profile. If you look at him, it really doesn't matter what the ideology is, as long as they show loyalty and he thinks he has them under control. So there might be a collision with Putin at one point, because this is not an actor that will be under anybody's control. So I don't know how that relationship is going to go. Now, in terms, you asked a question which I was thinking about as Peter was saying. Look, let's work backwards. The only thing that will guarantee a peace in Ukraine, a real one, is Ukraine to be so well armed and Europe to have such a vast defense industry with its sharp edge in Ukraine that Ukraine and Europe is secure, because Russia simply cannot go further. There are no agreements that Russia will hold to. That's just a game. That's just propaganda. They'll do it if it sort of helps split Europe, but it means nothing. The only thing they care about is where are they stopped. They will go as far as they're stopped. And actually, that's usually how peace works. The two sides go, okay, we can't go further. And the quickest way to get to that is for, people use the metaphor of Israel, whatever, Ukraine to be so well armed and the European defense industry to be so well coordinated for Europe to have a genuine industrial policy that Russia knows, okay, we can't go further. That also means that Europe's hybrid tools will be so sharp that Russia knows, okay, we've met our match. We've got a lot back. Okay, now we can't go further because it's a risk to us. Yeah? And they have to change their calculations. So if America absconding and the clarity of that becoming clearer, I mean, I don't believe any of this stuff about NATO security guarantees. That's all gone. I mean, it might stay de jure, but de facto, I'm taking the extreme position that it's kind of gone. So until you have that sort of defense posture, Russia will keep on moving, and maybe bizarrely, in a catastrophic way, what America is doing will catalyze that. And we'll see a new Europe emerge with Ukraine as its front line. That's a lot of ifs, but maybe that's the only path to a genuine peace.
Mark, do you see Europe go that way, to rearm, and is it going to happen fast enough?
I would like to see, because actually, regarding to Mr. Pomerantsev, what said, this is peace through superior firepower, which is the core of my profession. So I would like to say
in the 19th century, industrial production, how many shells can you produce a day? I mean, that's what we're back to.
Yeah, history is repeating itself because we don't learn from history. So regarding the question, I hope it will, and it should not just in a military industrial complex, but just two personal examples. When I appeared in media, for example, in last autumn, and I was talking about the North Korean soldiers in the Russian side. I mean, after 5 minutes after it has been published, a comment appeared that it said it's a big fat lie. There are no North Korean soldiers in Kursk, and this comment had 40 likes in 5 minutes. I mean, I mean, I'm not an expert of it, but this can be an informational operation. And on my YouTube channel, which is a very small, I barely have 5,000 subscribers. And when I published the video in the 24th of February, the 3rd anniversary of the commencement of the full-scale invasion, and I was talking about the Hostomel Airport Russian air assault operation, and I said that VDV, kind of a battalion, because it was not a whole battalion, that VDV battalion got practically destroyed. And I received comments like this after 5 or 10 minutes that, okay, this is a big fat lie, it was a Russian victory because the Hostomel airport was captured. Yeah, it was captured 24 hours after that battalion got destroyed there. So, yes, these things are happening. And so regarding the question, military industrial complex and the sharp powers and the hard powers are useless only if these are the factors that we concentrate on, because this is the easier, because it needs only money and will. But to sharpen the sharp powers and to make some order in the minds and the heads of the population, I think it's more difficult.
Well, jumping on this, I would just add that yes, I absolutely agree with that. And apparently, as long as we are not able to deter properly Russia from what it's doing, papers do not matter much. Papers do not matter much to Russia because, for instance, if we look at this single case of Ukraine, we can see that there were 5 international agreements and contracts with Russia just have torn to pieces and has put in the trash bin. So without power to deter Russia properly, I'm afraid that all our next papers are going to share the same fate. So how to deter Russia? Because up until now, what we have seen from the West, unfortunately, was an absolute mismanagement of the situation. We were managing red lines. We were managing and walking around those red lines which Russia has drafted. But if we think about those red lines, whenever Russia has drafted a red line, there was usually also put a threat next to the red line. So, okay, if you do that, then there is going to be some terrible consequence. Then there is going to be certain nuclear escalation or whatsoever. There were so many red lines. There were over 20 red lines in the last 3 years. And if you look at the list of these red lines, Europe and the collective West has crossed most of them. And all these red lines which we have crossed have faded into pink, and pretty much nothing happened afterwards. So what Russia is doing is clear psychological operations, because of course we are afraid of escalations. The European popular opinion is obviously afraid of escalations, but Russia uses it against us. And so unfortunately, we have no other option than to properly arm ourselves, to properly deter Russia to deter it from what it is doing now. Because simply to think about that, if we appease Russia's appetite for further territories, once it's going to stop, right? Well, what we have seen until now does not really underpin this.
Well, let's talk a little bit about information war, because that's one of our topics, and I'm sure that many of you are really interested in how this information war is fought and what can we do to deter or debunk disinformation, or what are the tools. And my question would go first to Peter Pomerantsev about the information war that you witness in the US at the moment. What are the weapons? What are the tools used? Is this really, can we talk about an information war there? Or is just this, what you mentioned in your keynote speech, this flood of information where people are basically lost and they want to have a strong leader whom they can follow no matter what happens?
So I don't know if you noticed yesterday, Twitter, now X, had a big outage. And Elon Musk immediately started going, oh, it's the Ukrainians have done a cyber attack on me. And it wasn't, of course. It was a group called Dark Storm. Dark Storm are a collective of cyber hackers who've been very involved in the US. But it's very interesting what they do. They did because of issues around Palestine and the arrest of a Palestinian American activist. And this was sort of their protest against that. But in the past, Dark Storm and other groups like Anonymous Sudan, these collectives of cyber forces, cyber criminals, they're very interesting because they work hand in glove with the Iranians, with the Russians. They will target not just X, they will target hospitals in America. They took down the website of the largest hospital in Los Angeles. They took down, they penetrated and took down water utility plants in America. They took down the Iron Dome on October the 8th in Israel. They're the same groups that are associated with actions throughout NATO countries. And it's very hard to pin down who they are. You know, they have relationships with Russian military intelligence. They have relationships with Iran. They seem to work in their interests very often. So, you know, when we're talking about information war writ large, these groups have been very, very active in America. They show the way Russia, Iran, criminals are all working together in this overall aim of subverting American interests. What's been quite stunning is when, you know, the current US administration came to power, for their own reasons, not because I think they love Russia, but for their own reasons, they dismantled all the US defenses against this. You know, everybody at Department of Homeland Security was looking at cyber attacks, malign influence attacks, attacks on elections. So America has just got rid of all of its defenses. We cannot argue why, but let's say it's just because they want different people doing this job. So America is currently defenseless. And it's very hard to attribute campaigns. The best campaigns are subtle, work through many proxies. So if I'm Russia, China, and Iran, I'm just staring at America, where they have just decapitated their own capacities to defend themselves. A country in a kind of huge amount of domestic turmoil that is chopping down its allies, that it's doing damage to its own currency. And I am thinking, wow, oh my God, the opportunities to just plunge America off its pedestal must be very tempting for the Kremlin, for Beijing, and for Iran right now.
So Peter Greco, is Putin celebrating now, and how do you see, are we losing the information war in Europe? Because that's also what we are witnessing in many countries. Just look at, you know, Romania. We'll talk about Hungary in details a bit later. Are we losing this war now?
Yeah, hard to say. Some very optimistic at the current moment. I would say that the information warfare of Russia can be the most efficient in the countries where it has support from the political mainstream. This is what we can observe in Hungary. This is what we can observe in the United States. And I think in other countries in the European Union as well. I think Romania is an interesting case in that respect, which but also we can see in the Romanian mainstream as well the presence of such narratives. So I think these are mostly politicians local politicians who can make these narratives successful. So if you only have Russia today, we don't have it anymore in the European Union because it's under the sanctions regime. Or if you have just very marginal Facebook sites and very extreme internet pages that spread Russian disinformation set up by the GRU or the Russian secret services and intelligence services, then it doesn't really have an effect. It has an effect when you have politicians who distribute these ideas. And in that respect, unfortunately, the feedback that many politicians receive in Europe is that it pays off politically, and I think the feedback in the United States as well, that it pays off. And I think this peace narrative, even if it's just really Orwellian in the sense that this is the peace that the aggressor likes to have at the very moment, but it definitely has an audience. And I think, yeah, every war after a while just becomes boring for the public, and the public just wants it to end because there is no sensation anymore. When a war goes on, usually the public loses its how to say compass. Who is the hero? Who is the villain? And it is going to be just something that has to come to the end. And right now, that's, I think, the fact that the war goes on for 3 years already have definitely created stronger demand for such kind of hypocritical peace message. While at the very beginning of the war, we could observe a different trend, a quite strong counter effect against the Russian disinformation. But if we look around in Europe, we can still see countries where the mainstream does not spread Russian disinformation big time. I think UK is an important example in that respect. And if you take a look at the public opinion polls, you can see that if the politicians themselves are more reserved, then the public opinion stands much more on the side of Ukraine. And still, if you read the Eurobarometer polls, a slight majority of Europeans are still more supportive towards the sanctions and definitely towards Ukraine than towards stopping the sanctions, and that's absolutely towards Russia. So Russia is still way more unpopular in the European public than Ukraine. So I think we cannot say that Russia have won the information war, but I think the next important phase just begins when the politicians have to persuade their own public that they have to cut on education, on healthcare, on social security, because there is a need to rearm Europe.
Dorka, how do you see that? You are an expert on disinformation. What could be the tactics? We almost all have children. I have a 17-year-old. What is going to be the world they are going to live in? How should they embrace against this disinformation which is flooding from social media? Could you give us some tactics or some tools how we should educate the next generation?
I wish we could give better advices than the ones we keep on giving, which are not being well received, because after a while we would need a certain political will in order to implement reforms, for instance, in strengthening the education of critical thinking, and so on. So unfortunately, I think that there is a limit until we can push, because after a while we would need certain other backing, which I do not really see at the moment. And I wish I could be more optimistic. I'm not particularly optimistic at the moment. And why I'm not, one of the reasons for this is that there were certain problems with moderation on social media platforms even up until now, especially in languages other than English. Think, for instance, about Hungary, a language which is spoken about slightly more than 10 million people across the globe. Well, the Hungarian moderators, should there be assigned for Facebook, for Instagram, or for other platforms, were only a handful. That doesn't really make, or did not really make, their work particularly impactful. And if you have ever tried to report certain hate speech or certain disinformation you yourself found, most likely you have never heard back from them, or the removal did not happen, or it happened all too late. So, I mean, there were problems already up until now, But now it looks like it can even get worse, simply because it was announced by the tech leaders that we are gonna get rid of even that little moderation we had. Well, if that really happens, that doesn't lead to anything good, particularly because, as we can see, as the AI is developing, the AI is making life a lot more difficult for instance, fact checkers in certain ways, especially because it can be exploited and it can empower those actors who, for instance, simply wish to flood our information space with more botnets, bot activities in order to derail the conversation, to create the illusion that all the other voices are single, lonely, therefore wrong, and to create this illusion that like all the other people or accounts impersonating people think in a different way. So for instance, AI in this respect is going to go wild, in my opinion, and especially if we downgrade our own abilities to fight this, for instance, getting rid of all the moderation we had. And there are many more problems which are going to be in an increasing way present, I think. So unfortunately, what I want to say with all this is that unfortunately the technology is not really going to help us at the moment, especially because social media profiles, they are not interested in removing those content which make us upset, which we find that it's obvious disinformation, yet if it brings our attention and if it feeds our attention, and it can be feeding, of course, the attention of the others too. Of course, what they monetize on is our attention. They are absolutely not interested in removing this content alone. So the EU has gone pretty far, at least compared to other actors across the globe. For instance, implementing the DSA, the Digital Services Act, which has been long discussed, already introduced last year, pretty much about a year ago. Yet, unfortunately, Europe alone, I think, is not going to be able to win this fight. Europe can make our lives in Europe somewhat better, but with regards to all those factors I already mentioned, it's not going to be an easy fight.
From a military point of view, how important is information war and disinformation? Is this something that the military experts regularly address? Is there something that is important, or it's more like, you know, boots on the ground and missiles and weapons? Or is this something that is like an extra battlefield?
This is absolutely an extra battlefield. Like we are living in a multi-domain conflict era, as most of you know, because actually military activities happen in the domain of the informational space, the actual space above us, in order to have an advantage on the ground, in the air, in the, like real domains, and then the sea, which Hungary is not so important. Yes, the information is very important in two levels. In the actual military operations, so actually, according to my PhD research, mainly this is why the initial Russian invasion failed, because the information in the military staffs and headquarters had not been transferred in the actual required tempo to support that maneuver operations that the Russians intended to execute. And the other way is the larger scope regarding morale, troops morale. It's like if you have a bad intent, informational operation attacking the troops of your troops, attacking the morale of your troops, you have to defend against it. It is easier, as we've seen in Ukraine, for example, in the Toretsk operational sector, where actually Ukrainian successes are going on in these days. They took away the mobile phones from the soldiers because they actually surged more on the events of the Trump and Zelensky and what is going on. But they should have been care about like pre-combat checks and things so on. So this is the easier way. But defending the troops' morale against propaganda, it's a 1,000-year-old job of the military headquarters and Department of Defenses, and it will remain a task until Homo sapiens try to kill another Homo sapiens. So this is my short answer. Yes, in two ways.
Thank you so much. I would like to go back a little bit to the freedom topic that you mentioned in your lecture, because I think that was very, very interesting, saying that freedom has become something of like a threat for many people, or liability, and we strive, or many people strive, for more security and strength. Is this really the direction the US society is going into? And this is what Trump's election and Trump's narratives are feeding into. So what would be your take on the future of the American democracy, like in the next, not all of that, like the next couple of years? Is this going to stay, or is this just a transitory period and then people will wake up and then they will return to the democratic values, or is this really something that will stay with us?
So firstly, I mean, we don't have to pitch freedom versus security. Yeah, you can make an argument that freedom and rights are an essential part of security. So it would be important not to. You don't have to pitch them against each other, but we can't deny where people are. Look, in my last book, it was about looking for comparisons between now and the 20s and 30s and the Second World War. And there are many comparisons in a time of vast technological change, vast social change, vast economic change, where, whole professions are disappearing, literally. Obviously, people feel unstable. And you can't ignore that. And there's either a healthy way of engaging with that or a very, very unhealthy one. So in the space that I work in, which is more about sort of propaganda and media and communication, there's a useful distinction between the public and the mass. It's one from sort of 1960s sociology. It's not a bad one. So the mass is the kind of the angry mob which has compensated for its feelings of fragility by looking to a leader that will humiliate others in its name, which is what we're seeing a lot of. And a healthy public is one that feels engaged with democracy, that feels empowered, that feels it has agency, and feels that it's part of a healthy community that can defend itself, but that doesn't have to humiliate others and doesn't look to a so-called strongman leader for its sense of empowerment. So those are the choices we face. So look, I bring this down to very simple things, like when I'm thinking about what is the journalism of the future, I think it might be less about just about objectivity and neutrality, which were very important values and are important values, but don't make up for the lack of trust and empowerment. So how do we create journalism that makes people not just feel, but actually makes people more empowered, gets them to experience that they are active members of society? So look, there's many choices that have to be made for journalists. What's the role of media in strengthening a public rather than a mass? What are the technological tools that we can use to make citizens feel more part of government? At the moment in America, in focus groups, when we ask people, how do you feel about democracy? A metaphor they often use, and it's a repeating metaphor, is that it's like a slot machine. You put money in and get nothing out. They feel no connection. Yeah, they feel that nobody's listening to them, and that has to be addressed. That has to be addressed. So in that gap of not feeling listened to, of not feeling that you matter, of something's broken down in the mechanism between the citizen and a feeling of representation. Until that's addressed, there's a huge gap for very nasty forces to operate, and to say, Trump's campaign slogan, "I am your retribution." Oof. So you have to work with that. Yeah. So yeah.
Peter, do we face the same dilemma in Europe? It seems very much like that. Yeah. Freedom and security. If we look at the last elections, European Parliament elections, but also national elections, we see kind of a progress of far-right parties, which promise security and less freedom. Well, of course, they speak about freedom, but that's not the freedom we mean. Freedom, it's basically strong leaders and stuff like that. Do we face this same dilemma in Europe?
I think, yeah, this Peter usually emphasizes, and based on his research, including his former research on Hungary as well, that yes, security is usually a bit of overlooked issue in the public opinion, where yeah, a lot of politicians tend to think that yeah, in let's say more or less liberal democracies, people feel safe, and that there is a multi-layered feeling of insecurity in the European public. I think right now the politicians have a good opportunity, but also a necessity to persuade the public about security, but in a different manner, like radical right parties usually do. So the hard security of Europe and the threat that Russia and a more unreliable United States as the former provider of security means, I think it should be brought into the public discussion. So yeah, I think there are fears over security, but these fears have to be also exploited to a certain extent to be able to bring leadership that Europe currently needs in rearming Europe, which we like it or not is really becoming a necessity. But I would respond to your question from a different angle as well. I think also when it comes to the concept of freedom, we clearly see a tendency of abusing the word of freedom and the the notion of freedom of speech. And let me quote here a politician. Real freedom of speech, which reflects different opinions, enables the search for compromises and common approaches to solve the world's problems. Guess who have told that? Sorry? No, Vladimir Putin. But we could think that it's something, a quote like from Churchill or Emmanuel Macron, Joe Biden. So no, Vladimir Putin, he strongly argued in favor of freedom of speech in a 2024 meeting at the BRICS summit. He delivered a speech for selected group of journalists who were lucky enough not to get murdered, not to get assassinated and imprisoned and so on. And he just argued in favor of freedom of speech, because who are the real enemies of freedom of speech in their eyes? These are European politicians who do not let Russian propagandists to do their work freely in the European soil. And also when we hear these days from the United States that freedom of speech is in essential danger in Europe, from politicians that send over circulars in the US administration that contain words such as social, economic, gay, ethnicity, stereotype. These are curse words that you cannot put into documents, official documents anymore. Then we can think a bit about how sincere this rhetoric of freedom of speech really is, while I think this is a powerful rhetoric. So I think many in Europe and the Western world have some guilt over that, oh, we are censoring certain kinds of speech, while the real enemies of freedom of speech these days, I think, are the most loud advocates of the so-called free speech.
Absolutely. Just to put it into context, just to assess the sincere nature of these worries of Vladimir Putin, how the free speech is disappearing. Well, let's not forget that in Russia there is a war censorship from the very first day of the invasion, so from 2022 and onwards. If you state anything with regards to the war, which cannot even be called a war in Russia, only a special military operation. So if you state anything which does not align with the Kremlin's narratives, you may face, especially if you commit this crime more than one time, you may face up to 15 years in prison. So much about the freedom of speech. So there is the freedom of speech. There is a technological censorship as well. Over 250,000 websites are currently blocked in Russia, as dangerous ones as well, such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Obviously, these are extremist and terroristic organizations, if you didn't know accidentally. So I think that it would be of quintessential importance to inform the public about these numbers, about these basic facts, because if someone who is not particularly interested in this topic simply hears these words, yeah, freedom of speech, it's important. Okay, if Vladimir Putin says it, yeah, it's also important. So, well, let's put it into context for more people than we put it in context for. because it's important. In this case, it's pretty important who these worries come from, and how seriously we should take them.
Let me just come back a little bit to Hungary, because we are just getting slowly to the end of our talks, and I wanted to address this very interesting innovation of the Hungarian government of launching non-binding national referendums or polls, basically. And now the latest idea of the government is to launch a poll or a referendum on Ukraine's EU membership. And I'm just wondering, how is it possible that in a country like Hungary, Ukraine has become lately the enemy, or it is portrayed as an enemy? What were the stages of that, and what do you think is behind, and how and why does it work so well? And I think maybe Peter, Greco, and Dorka, and then, yeah.
Can I start? So I'll be happy to talk about it, especially because recently we had a study about exactly that with the think tank I'm affiliated with currently. And so what we have found is that it's pretty interesting. So what we have found is that, of course, if you look at any public opinion poll, you will find that most Hungarians do not really feel an overwhelming sympathy towards Ukraine. You can clearly see it in, for instance, what is the support for Ukraine's future EU membership. The ratio of those who reject it immediately is over 50%. So what you can clearly see is that this unfriendly attitude is palpable. What we can also see is, however, especially if we dig a little deeper, that this antipathy towards Ukrainian politicians, the country itself, to the whole concept of Ukraine, kind of lacks certain basic elements. So, for instance, we conducted focus group interviews where we tried to dig deeper. So where does this antipathy come from? So, because we clearly see that in the recent years there was an ongoing and constant propaganda campaign, mostly armored and supported by the pro-government propaganda empire. So we should not underplay the importance of all this, but they wouldn't have even started it, wouldn't have measured that, okay, it's going to resonate with more people than the Fidesz core voter base. So what we can see is that most Hungarians, however, even though their affiliation and their opinion with regards to Ukraine is not positive at all, eventually it's pretty negative, it does not stem from historic grievances, so you cannot really sense there or feel there the Trianon trauma or anything like that. This is not on the top of their worries with regards to Ukraine at all. Also, they have barely ever met a Ukrainian person, so it does not stem from bad personal expertise or experience, which is also pretty interesting. But what we can see is that the propaganda's impact is enormous. So most likely, or at least how we sense what happened, was that there was a void in the Hungarian popular opinion's knowledge about Ukraine as a whole. Obviously, Ukraine has not really been a frequented destination for travelers amongst Hungarians. There is also the language barrier, which, for instance, with other Slavic nations and Ukrainians, this language barrier is a lot less of an obstacle of communication. So there has been kind of a void in the Hungarian popular knowledge about Ukraine. However, it's even worse, because what the Hungarian popular opinion has seen about Ukraine in the media in the last most likely 10 years or so was through the lens of Transcarpathia. Because what they have seen in the Hungarian media was how the Hungarian minority situation in Transcarpathia was far from perfect. Actually, there were serious problems. There is also an immense poverty, and that was all they have seen from Ukraine. So what they might imagine is that, well, all Ukraine is like that, all Ukraine is terrible, they oppress their minorities whatsoever. So of course reality has little to do with it all, but I think that the fact that Hungarian media was portraying Ukraine over the lens of Transcarpathia kind of accounts for more. And unfortunately, from this very initial kind of bad side taste, it was already very easy to build on these very intense propaganda campaigns. And what else we have found during this study was that people, even those people who consciously do not dislike neither the government's stance in the words different issues, they do not like the propaganda at all. They dislike it, they criticize it, they even say that, well, it doesn't work at all, who believes it? they themselves were parroting the propaganda's lies when it came to Ukraine. They themselves were parroting Orban's panels about how it's the war of two Slavic nations and we should not intervene. They were parroting that it shouldn't be the Hungarian people to pay for this war, and so on. So even those people who consciously do not like any of the Orban rhetorics, they themselves are parroting it, and that is pretty alarming. And I would like to just mention the only silver lining we have found in this study is that given that these negative opinions do not seem to stem from personal grievances or historic grievances, but are the direct result of the propaganda's hard work into which a lot of time and a lot of taxpayers' money was invested into, should there be another government or should the political will change? Most likely this kind of very negative opinion of Hungarians with regards to Ukraine, most likely they can be changed. And one more thing is that apparently the dislike of Hungarians towards Ukraine has a very important economic lag. So it is no coincidence that the government, for instance, started this hate campaign against Ukraine just now, when there are economic problems. And there were economic problems already years ago. Let's remember back to the moment when Hungary produced the highest inflation rate in Europe. We really had a high inflation, a super high inflation for years. So it meant people started to feel it on their pockets, and there was a very conscious misattribution of this problem. If you remember back, the governmental rhetorics immediately started to call it war inflation and sanctions inflation, as if the war accounted for it, or as if the sanctions introduced by the European countries accounted for it. And apparently these messages went through, and unfortunately the cherry on top was when in the summer of 2023 the Hungarian governmental propaganda has connected two messages, and after that these connected messages were pushed very hard by the propaganda media, and it seemed to work. Those two messages which were connected was that on the one hand, if you remember back to the summer of 2023, by that time a serious amount of money from the European Union, which was supposed to come to Hungary, was already frozen due to rule of law issues and problems over there. So there was already an amount of money which Hungary was supposed to get and did not. Yet there were already certain discussions which have started that the EU is going to provide another package of 50 billion euros to Ukraine. And what the governmental propaganda did in the summer of 2023, they have connected these two messages. And the result was that Ukraine gets the money which would be ours. So Ukraine gets our money. They don't deserve it. That is our money. And after that, the propaganda was pushing these messages, and this went deep.
Just a very short thought on that. There was a poll at the, I think less than a half after the full-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine, an international poll of Ipsos that showed a quite interesting pattern in the Hungarian public opinion. Hungarian public opinion compared to other European publics was one of the least supportive towards military aid to Ukraine. It was one of the least supportive towards financial aid to Ukraine. It was not so supportive towards sanctions against Russia, but it was highly supportive towards inviting and accepting Ukrainian refugees. I think this package in itself makes no sense. There is no logical connection behind, but it is exactly the pattern of the Hungarian official governmental narrative. So we should not finance this war. We have to be cautious. We have to be left out. But we are very generous. Therefore, we let Ukrainian refugees to come to the country. And what we could see in the public opinion polls was the real reflection of the governmental narratives. And in Hungary, I think, and unfortunately, it has not changed. Foreign policy opinions are formed almost in a monologue. So foreign policy is what the government does, and usually opposition parties are either reluctant to challenge it or to unpopular to make a real impact on the public opinion. So if if it does not change, then we shouldn't be surprised that the governmental propaganda, as Dorka have described, has this very visible impact on the public opinion. Yeah, Hungarians are not, how to say, evil historically, and also if we take a look at the polls right after the invasion, first there was a huge wave of sympathy and empathy, even in the Fidesz camp, towards Ukrainians as the victims of the conflict. Then it was quite systemically, how to say, hollowed out by the governmental rhetoric. Peter, any experiences to add from Russia maybe, or your polls on Hungary?
I'm just a visitor here, but I don't know. But I'm fascinated to hear what you're saying. Yeah, okay, fine. I mean, I'm just fascinated because I've heard so many things about so many years about the Hungarian view of security and how it's important to be inside different institutions and play them off each other. And, you know, that's, you know, I've heard many lectures about it. And all I can do is listen to it. I'm not in a position to judge it. I just wonder what happens to Hungary's security strategy if, as seems to be the case, America is radically leaving this space. The new security architecture is not going to be the EU. It'll be some sort of European security compact with Ukraine as its sharp tip. And I just wonder where that leaves Hungary. If Hungary is not part of that, not part of the 800 billion investment into it, not part of the intelligence sharing, not part of any kind of guarantees, then is Hungary back where it started in the mid-19th century? Is the end result of the game of playing everybody to be completely alone? I don't know. I just wonder what the debate is around that here.
That's a good one because you stole my last. You stole my last question to Mark, because this is actually what I wanted to ask him, that what happens to Hungary when Hungary remains in this vacuum in Europe and being not part of the European security architecture, but perhaps having a neighbor, Ukraine, with which relations are not really very friendly, and we don't know how far Russia will get into that territory, so we might even, you know, have Russia very close to us. So what's Hungary's future, security future?
Well, it's only my opinion, and this is the worst case scenario, worst case course of action. When Hungary will sit in the loving umbrella of Moscow next to Belarus and Transnistria and lovely countries like this. Hope not. I hope not. Because that's why I quit the army. And I mean, yes, I don't know how many minutes you have. I tried to quit the army twice, and because the first time they just said, "You were not gonna quit. Go back to your job," and that's all. And the second time I wrote in the letter of application for allow me to quit the army that I don't intend to serve in a country's army that behaves like this, and I made some bullet points. And the reaction of the chief of the general staff said, "Okay, promote this guy to a major and come this guy next to me." And that is the time that I quit with the law binding. And in Hungary we always we don't operate by the rules. We find the small loopholes between the rules, and that's helped me. So this is my short answer. But regarding the security, I hope that, because I almost got right here late, because I had a lecture in my former brigade, the former 5th Mechanized Brigade. Now it's 11th Armored Cavalry Brigade for no good reason, because there are no horses, and they are still mechanized infantry. And I had a lecture to the brigade, the commander and brigade staff on how the brigade in defense in Ukraine now it looks like. And I was talking to my former colleagues and comrades and commanders and former students as young lieutenants, and they don't really like it also, because they don't know that if we cannot defend ourselves. I mean, in the 0-point military training field, when I was a young captain and leading my company in a multinational exercise, actually with the Italian and American forces, I mean, I saw the whole Hungarian army 3 kilometers that way and 4 that way, and that's all. I mean, by the afternoon we all go home if you survive the first combat. So yeah, I don't really hope it will happen. That's the truth. Sorry, I mean, truth is our friend, as you all said. I mean so yeah, this regarding just some only last final notes. So yes, the Hungarian people are not evil from birth, and some parts of Hungary are not that well educated, and they can be misled by state-sponsored and propaganda. But the soldiers, the officers, the young officers who really are the backbone, the young NCOs really are the backbone of the armed forces. As myself were, we have took part in combat operations. I led my platoon in 2015 against the ISIS in Iraq, side by side with the Kurdish and American forces. And this is not war. Okay, we've been out there 48, 36 hours, actually taking casualties. Thank God I brought all my people home, all my men home. But this is not war, because at the end of the day we had a hot meal and a hot shower. And what is going on in Ukraine? It is war. I mean, I don't have to present it to you. And if this notion can be this peace of mind can be transferred to the armed forces, I mean, it is already transferred because the officers are transferring their mindset to their people. But this can be transferred, that kind of empathy and sympathy to the Ukrainian people, which Mr. Peter Krakow already mentioned. This can turn the table, and this can save us from the thing that I mentioned earlier, sitting in the loving arms of the Russian bear next to lovely countries like Belarus. And that's my hope. And hope this will be the most plausible course of action. And thank you.
Yeah, let's close at this very promising and optimistic end. And I'm just wondering, we do have a couple of minutes for questions now. Yeah, yeah, short and questions, please. No statements, because we don't have time for that. Yeah, let's collect a few questions.
Thank you, Charles Kovacs. I'll be very brief. Thank you very much for telling us all this. But one of the things I'm missing, maybe deliberately, from the speaker's point of view, I don't know. But all right, the Russians are doing all these things, and what are we going to do? What is Europe going to do? I didn't hear anything about an offensive. So what can you do to raise the cost? And that will be certainly part of the problem, that we're faced with an attack on multi-fronts, different methods, and there's no deterrence and no cost. And I'm just wondering if you might perhaps address that point.
Mark Lusto, American freelance journalist. I'm curious about Russian disinformation in the high cultural sphere, and here I have particularly in mind a film that was shown at the Budapest International Documentary Film Festival, Russians at War. And this poses, I think, questions that are different from the ones that you considered about online social media. Here you have high cultural, intellectual institutions like film festival organizations considering what is or what is not propaganda. What can those institutions do to have a better critical lens?
Hi, hi. My name is Kostadi. I'm also a journalist. Mark, a question for you very quickly. To paraphrase you, peace will come when we kill enough of the other side.
That's not what I said. General Curtis LeMay said to the Japanese, sir.
All right. Okay. Well, yeah. But as far maybe I watch too many Ukrainian biased videos, but it seems to me Vladimir Putin is actually killing more of his own people than Ukrainians. So could it come back to hit Vladimir Putin? And one little question, which is perhaps impossible for the Ukrainian experts: what has public opinion been gauged as to the Russian-speaking peoples of Ukraine, both in Ukrainian-controlled territory and in Russian-controlled territory? I know that's perhaps a ridiculous question, but I'd just like to know your opinions. Thank you.
So no more questions. I would ask any or each of you to wrap it up a little bit. Peter, would you start?
Yeah, I'll do the how to push Russia back. So in terms of changing Russia's calculation around full-scale war, I think you have to understand that there is no silver bullet. There was this idea at the start that a sanction would do it. The Russian leadership have their own idea of their own security and their own sense of control, and it's really about a way of putting them into so many dilemma situations that they feel they can't deal with it. So it would mean combining economic warfare with pressure on society inside, with asking military questions, let's say in Finland or around Kaliningrad. But it's all about sequencing. Yeah, at the moment, like, we do a sanction, we sit, we wait, we signal, essentially. That's what the Biden administration did. It's like, don't be a naughty boy, we've done one more thing. That's not how they work. So you would have to do a kind of a combined set of economic, informational, military, and international operations that would get them to go, okay, we're not dealing with the amount of stuff being thrown at us. A kind of a DDoS attack on the central decision-making system of the Russian state. To use a word that I rather like from Russian gangster culture, koshmarit, to nightmare them. And then they go, okay, we cannot deal with this amount of pressure. We feel that we're losing control. Deeply connected, by the way, to their sense of domestic control. You have to put pressure there as well. And then they will recalculate what they need to do. And we see it over and over again. When mobilization got out of hand, they haven't tried mobilization again. And so on. So you have to change their calculations, but you've got to understand there is no single silver bullet. You probably can't do it without serious pressure on oil exports, because that is, the sort of the most important part of their economy. But it's all about overloading them, and we've never done that. We've always been about signaling. It's always been they do something, we do something to show that we mean business. That's not the sort of approach that works for them. So that's about stopping the immediate, that's peace through strength. If we're serious about peace through strength, that's the way to go for it. That doesn't solve the long-term issue. I think you're talking about more in the hybrid space. How do we create deterrence in the information war, which I think is your question as well. That's a really interesting question, because that's the opposite of what we do. We do, at best, mitigation or hardening. But you're quite right. The way forward is to go, okay, you're attacking our vulnerabilities around corruption, around elections. What are your vulnerabilities? So that would, I think, mean putting pressure on them domestically, which is completely taboo at the moment. There are huge pressure points throughout their societies. It would mean thinking about their supply chains in a very, very structural way and taking out the key nodes in their supply chains around military technology to signal we're going to keep on degrading this and degrading this and degrading this. Have a look at a superb piece of research by the Open Society Center that's allied to RUSI about how you undermine howitzer production in Russia. But it's all about signaling to them. We know your supply chain. We know every illegal front company you've been setting up for 40 years. We know every operative. We know every place that the money is flowing through. And look, boom, bye-bye, boom, bye-bye, boom, bye-bye. It's about disrupting their relationship with China. Massive dilemma situations to put the Chinese and the Russians in. No? So it's about doing our version of economic and information warfare back at them, which makes them go, oh, okay, yeah, you guys mean business. Let's talk. They will talk, by the way, when they see they have a serious opponent. Their vulnerabilities are vast. Yeah? Just go and start mapping. We're obsessed with our vulnerabilities. Their vulnerabilities are absolutely massive. We just haven't done it because we keep on wishing it'll go away. And now we're moving to an even more dangerous place where we want to enable them. I hope that delusion fades quickly.
So I would pick the question with regards to the Budapest International Documentary Festival, most likely because I was also involved in that. I was the ambassador of a different movie, but I remember that before airing this ominous, this already mentioned movie, which is called The Russians at War, there were heavy discussions. We had heavy discussions whether it should take place at all, what should we do, and why the organizers have decided that they are going to show it was that, okay, they are going to show it with educational reasons. So it was far from just showcasing and just leave it on air. No. It was actually accompanied by expert discussions, because clearly this is a film which is heavily divisive. And obviously, a certain part of it is propaganda. Of course, it is Russian propaganda. However, I think that the decision the organizers made as of showing this movie, yet giving out handouts before at the ticket office that, look, this is our stance. What you are going to see is propaganda. We do not share these values. And afterwards, these screenings were followed with expert discussions with Hungary's best experts on propaganda, information warfare, and Russian propaganda exactly. So I think that since it was in an environment where it was showed with educative reasons, I think we can defend this decision, or I think that we can look at it in a different light, simply because, I mean, let's not lie to ourselves. We are in Hungary being bombarded with massive pro-Russian propaganda all the time. So if we can showcase at least some part of it and talk about it and raise awareness of it, that look, let's talk about the issue, let's talk about the phenomenon, what makes it propaganda, how can we describe propaganda at all? I think that in this case, and this definitely was a case for that, I think that this was the right decision. So I think this was far from simply turning a blind eye over Russian propaganda. It was something different. So I think that given that it all happened with an educative purpose, I think it had a place.
So I take the question regarding the casualty rate, you sir. I'm sad to report that so far, regarding the whole 3 years of the full-scale invasion, we have approximately 1.83 Russian casualties to 1 Ukrainian casualty, which is not good. So in this tempo, Ukrainian population will diminish sooner than the Russian. And I don't know if anybody knows. Maybe some CIA experts. I don't know if there is a point in Russia when they will fed up, like they fed up in 1917. I don't know. And so this is why it's very important, as Mr. Pomerantsev said, to find their weaknesses and to support Ukraine as much as they want, as long as they intend to. Because if we don't, they will run out of men faster than the Russians will. That's my short answer.
Very short remarks at the end. So on what to do at the moment, I think what seems to be a strategy that has utterly failed is to try to keep Ukraine alive but does not led it to win the war. And this is, I think, what most of European decision makers had in their mind, this cautiousness. It's like not deciding if we are in the paradigm of peace or the paradigm of war. And we can see right now the consequences. And I think the world of the West, I mean, the future of the Western world is decided on the battlefields of Ukraine at the moment. So it's not just one war. I think it's the war that's mostly, I think, the Western civilization, future of liberal democracies depend on. So the stakes are pretty high, and to be a bit optimistic here at the end, I think, Russia is right now also have, as it was mentioned by Mark, for example, have suffered a lot of casualties. Its military has weakened. So Europe has to wake up, and Europe has some time, at least beyond, of course, providing Ukraine with weapons, to prepare itself for some more dark times. And in that respect, I really admire, and I don't want to be too flattery here, the leadership that UK took in that moment. I think the meeting in Paris, but especially the meeting in London afterwards, and also the fact that UK and Europe is coming together again, which is very idea that close to my heart. So I think it also shows that maybe there is some slow awakening, but there is some awakening. Some former big friends of the United States, including countries like Canada, I think are much more sidelining Europe in the current situation than the United States in geopolitical views. So I think, there is, and if we add these countries together that are rather committed to defend Ukraine and also to build up some defense capabilities that might work even if the United States is more unreliable, I think if we add these countries together, I think in terms of economy, in terms of population, and also in terms of military, it's rather impressive.
Thank you very much, and I think our time is up now. Thank you very much for the excellent panelists, for their thoughts, for the inspiration, and for the optimistic tone in those dark times. And thank you very much for coming and spending the afternoon with us. Thanks a lot.